And let's talk about that for a second. I've failed a check ride. In fact, I've failed 3 check rides. I was one flight away from being kicked out of pilot training. You're listening to the VSL Aviation Podcast. I'm your host, Seth Lake, and this is episode 19. Thanks for listening. In today's episode, we're going to discuss failing a check ride. This is a podcast I've been wanting to do for a while because, let's face it, everybody is scared to fail a check ride. It's not anything somebody wants to do. When you go to take a check ride, you definitely don't want to have that outcome. But it's something that unfortunately just has to happen because there are standards. And since there are standards, then that means you have to be able to fail. And if you can fail, somebody's going to fail. That's just the way that it is. So I figured the best way to make people feel better about this is to just paint the picture that it's not a big deal if you fail, first of all. Second of all, there's a very straightforward process on how to recover from a check ride failure. And then I wanted to discuss kind of the career impacts or the impacts that it might have on your career once you have a failure on your record, which I think is a big reason why a lot of people are concerned about it, is because they just think it's just going to have these terrible implications on their career. And I've addressed this in other episodes, but the short answer is it's not a big deal. So what I'm going to cover in this episode is some common reasons for failures, and then how you're going to recover from that and kind of your options there. So you're going to know this going into the check ride, and you won't be so scared about it because it's not a big deal. So stay tuned. All right, you might notice that I'm in a slightly different location if you're watching YouTube. If you're listening, you might hear some other sounds that you don't normally listen to because I'm recording this at my house in the middle of nowhere, Arkansas. So beautiful scenery, and it's a lot nicer to do it here than it is my office, quite honestly. So kind of like this. But try not to mind the chicken noises or dog noises that might occur. Hopefully they'll be quiet, but who knows? Talking about failure, the first thing is what could cause you to have a failure? And a failure to, strictly speaking, pulling up the ACS here, failure is specifically addressed in Appendix 5. And then Appendix 5, page A9, that's the possible outcomes of the test. So I've got that pulled up, and so if you're watching YouTube, you have that up. If you're just listening to the podcast, I'll kind of read through what the ACS says about a check ride failure. In the back, I did this in the last episode, but I wanted to review it on this one. But it defines satisfactory performance and unsatisfactory performance. The ACS does. So satisfactory performance, I won't go into that because that's not what we're here to talk about. We're here to talk about an unsatisfactory performance. Typical areas for unsatisfactory performance and grounds for disqualification include, and then it lists some other stuff. Now, it's just used kind of 2 different words here, and then I've used a third. I've called it a failure, and then the ACS talks about unsatisfactory, and then disqualification. And then the formal term of the outcome is a disapproval. So you won't ever get a check ride failure officially. You'll get a notice of disapproval. That's the formal language that the FAA uses to basically say that you've failed the check ride. So here's some areas that the ACS specifically calls out of saying, hey, these are some common ones. Any action or lack of action by the applicant that requires corrective intervention by the evaluator to maintain safe flight. Failure to use proper and effective visual scanning techniques to clear the area before and while performing maneuvers. Consistently exceeding tolerances stated in the skill elements of the task. Failure to take prompt corrective action when tolerances are exceeded, and failure to exercise risk management. So those are 5 kind of common ways that a disapproval or unsatisfactory or failure could occur. And those are kind of necessarily kind of broad, right? So the first one, any action or lack of action by you that requires me, the examiner, to keep us safe. So if I have to take the controls because you failed to do something, or you didn't flare and I have to snatch the controls to keep us from having a hard landing or something like that, then that is basically an automatic disapproval. Not scanning the area, okay, that one's pretty self-explanatory, so make sure you're doing clearing turns. Consistently exceeding tolerances. This one's interesting because the word consistently, right? The FAA knows that words matter. And by saying consistently, what they're saying is that simply exceeding tolerances once or twice is not a big deal. So if you're, for instance, doing steep turns and you get off altitude a couple of times, not a huge deal, right? But if you're consistently off altitude throughout, let's say, the whole maneuver, or you get off altitude maybe twice during steep turns, and then you get off altitude during slow flight, and then you get out altitude in another area, well, you just demonstrated consistency in not being able to maintain altitude. So that would be grounds for disapproval in that case. But just once or twice is not a big deal. So this is kind of the ACS's way of saying, or the FAA's way of saying, that perfection isn't the standard, because you need to demonstrate consistency in getting out of tolerance. It's not just once or twice. The next one, failure to take prompt corrective action when tolerances are exceeded. This one is the same kind of thing as the one before it. It's saying, okay, you've exceeded tolerances. As long as you take a prompt corrective action, then that's not necessarily grounds for disapproval. But if you don't take prompt corrective action, then that could be grounds for disapproval. So we've got two, that's our second subjective word, right? We've got the word consistently. Consistently is a subjective word, right? And then we have the word prompt. Well, I can't find a definition of prompt anywhere. And that's what I mean by being objective versus subjective, right? So, an objective standard is being able to complete steep turns plus or minus 100 feet of altitude loss or gain. That's I can measure that, right? Consistently, how do you measure that, right? Plus or minus what? Is that, if you're consistently off tolerances, does that mean 2 times? Does that mean 3 times, 4 times, 5 times? The answer is it kind of depends, and it's a little subjective. Prompt is the same thing. So if you get off altitude and you correct within 5 seconds, is that prompt? Or 15 seconds or 30 seconds? I think there's some gray line there where, okay, now it's been 30 seconds. This isn't very prompt. Or if it's been a minute and we've been off altitude, that's not a very prompt corrective action. So, but there's some subjectivity there. And that's really why I'm there as the examiner, right? In theory, we could just put a Stratus puck or something like it in the airplane with you, have you go fly the ACS, all the maneuvers that the ACS outlines, and it will be able to see your bank angle and your speeds and your altitudes. And basically when you land, I could download everything off that GPS puck and say, hey, you passed, or no, you didn't pass. That would be a purely objective Checkride. The reason I think we don't do that is there's a lot of things that are subjective. It's just impossible to be purely objective, right? You have to take airmanship and the weather and challenges that you might have with airspace. All that goes into just as a whole being an airman, and being able to judge airmanship is kind of a subjective thing. So the FAA does its best to choose experienced examiners. That's one way to protect against that. It's also, we standardize our examiners. The FAA tries to standardize examiners through training. It also gives us the same sheet of music with the airman certification standards and make sure that we're using that. And that helps us be as objective as possible, but it's impossible to just be purely objective. We just can't do it. And I would argue you probably don't want that because that would really lead you down a path of you have to be perfect or near perfect. And just none of us are capable of doing that consistently. So there's that word again, consistently. Anyway, the next one is failure to exercise risk management. That one is kind of a catch-all, right? Risk management, we use risk management all the time. I would argue that, clearing turns are a form of risk management. Continuing an unstable approach, I think that would be a clear demonstration of poor risk management. You can always go around, and that's one of the things that I say during my check rides is that go-arounds are free. You can do as many go-arounds as you want. There's one exception, and that's the power off 180. Some recent guidance from the FAA has said that, if you're doing a power off 180 and you need to do a go-around because you're not going to hit your aim point, then that's an automatic disapproval, basically. I used to say, well, you can do one go around because it references that in the risk management area, but that's not the intent of the FAA. So that's the one maneuver that you can't do a go around and still pass, if that makes sense. So it's not that you can't do a go around. If you need to do a go around, do a go around. But if you have to do a go around and it's something other than safety of flight, then that's going to be a disapproval. So during let's flush that out. During a power off 180, if you're doing, and this is a maneuver in your commercial check ride as well as most CFI check rides, you're going to have the power off 180 accomplished. But that power off 180 approach, if you have to go around because of bad technique, that's disapproval. However, if you have to go around because of safety of flight, and that could be another aircraft on the runway, wildlife on the runway, something that's kind of outside of your control that doesn't have to do with your technique, then that's allowed. And yeah, if you have to do a go around, that's fine. You're just going to do a go around, come back and reaccomplish the maneuver, and that won't be a disapproval. But in all other cases, go arounds are free. So if you continue an approach that should have been a go around, then that shows me that you have poor risk management, and that could be grounds for disapproval. So if you need to do a go around, do a go around. The next paragraph here is, if in the judgment of the evaluator the applicant does not meet the standards of any task, the applicant fails the task and associated areas of operation. The test is unsatisfactory and the evaluator issues a notice of disapproval. The evaluator lists the area or areas of operation in which the applicant did not meet the standards, any areas or areas of operation not tested, and the number of practical test failures. The evaluator should also list the tasks failed or tasks not tested with any unsatisfactory or partially completed area or areas of operation. If the applicant's inability to meet English language requirements contributed to the failure of a task, the evaluator must note English proficiency in the notice of disapproval. Last paragraph here, the evaluator or the applicant may end the test if the applicant fails a task. The evaluator may continue the test only with the consent of the applicant. The applicant is entitled to credit only for those areas of operation and the associated tasks performed satisfactorily. All right, so that kind of takes you through maybe the life cycle of a failure there a little bit as it happens in the plane. Is so if for any reason you fail a task, you fail that task and the overarching area of operation, you do get to keep credit for the tasks that you successfully completed. And I can get granular in the disapproval and go down to a specific skill that I'm issuing the disapproval for. And that's what I try to do, is be specific as possible. So I'll be as specific as possible in listing the areas of operation that you are receiving a disapproval for. And then I'll put down all of the areas that we didn't accomplish. That way, now normally 9 times out of 10, I'm the examiner that's going to complete the retest. So I'm going to have that context on what you need to be retested on. And I remember, here's what we did before and you got credit for, so I know what we're going to do on the retest. But we have to write the disapprovals. We being the examiners have to write the disapprovals so that any examiner could pick up that letter of disapproval, have a very clear understanding of what you were disapproved for, and be able to successfully conduct a retest. So that's the reason why we list the areas of operation that you were disapproved for as specifically as possible. The next thing this talks about here, that last paragraph, is saying that you basically, as the applicant, you have the option to continue a test after you've received disapproval. You don't have to, but you can. And in my experience, it's probably 50-50 on the applicants that choose to do that. So if it's early on in the check ride, I'd say most of the time the applicant's like, yeah, let's go ahead and continue. I want to get as much done as possible, and I can agree with that. That's fine. And so we'll continue, and we might finish out successfully the rest of the check ride. And so at the end, you might just have 1 or 2 tasks that you have to do on a subsequent retest, which we'll talk about here in a couple seconds. Now, if it's towards the end of the test, and this has happened a few times, well, I think the most common area to receive a disapproval for is probably either an approach or landing task. So something that happens in the runway environment. That's the most common areas that I see I have to issue disapprovals for is like a takeoff or landing task, an approach if it's on an instrument, a pattern entry that's been messed up before. If it happens then, and depending on how the applicant takes it, they might just decide, hey, I'm done. I've had a long day. I'm kind of stressed out now. There's just 3 or 4 more things that I have to do anyway, so let's go ahead and full stop, and we'll end it. There's been a couple times where I've kind of insisted, hey, I'm going to have to issue a disapproval. The applicant, is upset because this is an upsetting event. If it hasn't happened to you, it can be an upsetting event. And I kind of just take the controls and I come back and I'll land. And, I can sympathize with that. I hope that you can learn more about a disapproval, by watching this or listening to this. And if a disapproval does happen to you, you can keep your composure and keep flying the airplane and realize that it's just not a big deal. But if the applicant is taking it hard, I'm going to take the controls because they're probably not in a good state of mind to safely fly us back. They probably could, but it's a huge distraction, right? And so it's just safer for me. I'm not bothered by it at all, really. It's just part of the job, and I realize that it happens. So I can fly us back and scan for traffic and do a successful, full stop back. And I don't care one way or the other what happens there, but I would like, pilots to keep their composure a little bit more. But I'm not going to hold it against you if you don't, because, I've kind of been there, done that. Are you nervous about an upcoming check ride? Have you ever wondered what it's like to be a designated pilot examiner? In this show, I give you a behind-the-scenes look of the FAA check ride process. I'll show you best practices on how to have a successful check ride, common errors that applicants struggle with, and share with you some of the valuable knowledge I've gained throughout my 15-year career in military and civilian aviation. For more information about the show, visit our website, vsl.aero/podcast. There you'll find the show library, various ways to support the show, and links to purchase our interactive Airman Certification Standards study guide. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and leave a 5-star review. Most importantly, tell your aviation friends about the show. This is listener-supported content, and I plan on keeping it that way. So any way you can support the show through Patreon or PayPal is greatly appreciated. Consider how much you would normally pay for an hour of ground school with an experienced CFI. Thanks for listening, and back to the show. And let's talk about that for a second. I've failed a check ride. In fact, I've failed 3 check rides. I failed 2 check rides in pilot training, in Air Force pilot training in the T6. So for 2 different reasons I failed. I went to elimination check and then basically a second elimination check. I was 1 flight away from being kicked out of pilot training, or failing out of pilot training. And they were just really kind of boneheaded mistakes. And it was, those 2 failures were early in my flying career, and they were terrible. A couple of the worst days I've ever had in my professional career. It was just terrible. But looking back on it now, it's not a big deal. It didn't have an impact on my career really at all. And then I failed another check ride in later on, which was, to me, that was the bigger deal, is in the C-130. I failed a check ride, and it wasn't for the flying portion. It was for a written exam. I rushed through a written exam and failed a written exam, which causes you to fail the entire check ride. And I learned an immense amount about myself from that, because that was hugely embarrassing to fail a written exam like that. And it was kind of a wake-up call, because I think it happened to me at a point in my career where I was getting a little complacent. And I just got a little complacent, and I didn't study like I should, and I didn't take it seriously. And yeah, that had a big impact. I learned more from those 3 failures than I have from any of the check rides that I've passed, which is the majority of them. I've taken, all but 3. I've taken a lot of check rides. I take at least 2 to 3 check rides a year. And that's not counting the check ride that I get from the FAA as an examiner. So you're evaluated a lot as a pilot. That's just a fact of life. So kind of get used to it. And I wanted to share my examples of failing a check ride, just to show, I'm sitting here as a flight examiner. I've had a successful career. I do corporate flying. I'm a flight instructor. I've got a great relationship with the FAA, and I get to mentor younger pilots, and it just wasn't a big deal. I kind of appreciate the fact that I have failed a check ride, because I can empathize. I think it helps at any rate. That is just me speculating, but I think when I have to give somebody a disapproval, I always tell them, hey, I've failed 3 check rides before. It's not a big deal. You're going to recover from this. So let's talk about, I kind of went through the impacts or non-impacts that my check ride failures have. If you have a failure, what is that going to do to you as a pilot? So let's talk about how a failure is going to impact your career from this point forward. So first off, from the FAA standpoint, nobody really cares. It's going to be documented. When you take another check ride, the examiner more than likely is not going to know. The one thing that I could notice, I don't look for this, but I do notice it in the logbook sometimes, is I'll see a sign off for a retest after a failure. So that shows me as an examiner, oh, okay, this person has failed a check ride. I really don't care, and I don't actually look for that because I want to maintain objectivity as much as I can. So I don't want to know if you failed previous check rides. I've given check rides to people that I have issued disapprovals for. So after the retest process, and I don't let that taint my opinion of them at all. Because again, it's just part of being a pilot. It's not a big deal. When it comes to a job interview, this is when check ride failures are going to come up. Is in a job interview. Most professional flying jobs, somewhere on their questionnaire or during the interview process, they'll ask you, "Have you ever failed a check ride?" And you'll have to answer yes. And to me, this is an opportunity because you don't always know what you're going to be asked during an interview, except for when you failed a check ride, 100% you're going to be asked about that failure. And it's not even 100%. I've had people that have had check ride failures on their record, and it never gets brought up in the interview. So, but plan on it coming up in the interview, and the person interviewing you knows that check ride failures happen. They themselves might have failed a check ride. And as a person that's interviewed pilots before, something that I would be looking for is if when I ask you about that failure, do you accept responsibility for that failure, or do you blame your instructor or an unfair examiner or the weather? Basically, if you don't take responsibility, if you don't own that failure, that's not a good thing. I don't look at that as a good way because, first of all, I know that failures happen, right? And the best thing you can do is just own up to it and say, I learned a lot from that and it made me a better pilot. That's the answer that I'm looking for. And some mix of that statement is you take ownership and you learned a lot and you moved on and it's not a big deal. Then it's fine. We're going to move right on to the next question. But if you are like, yeah, my examiner just didn't like me and he needed to meet his quota and he just wanted to make extra money, yeah, I wouldn't say that. Now, if it's proven somehow that it was an unfair failure, I would maybe talk to a professional interview prep person to see how you would phrase that, to bring that up. Like, yeah, there was some impropriety that happened with this failure. It shouldn't be on the record, but it is. It's not a big deal, if that is the case. But 99% of the time, it's legitimate that you had a disapproval. So just own it and move on. Not a big deal. Right after the failure, how do you recover from that? So the process is when I issue the disapproval, we start a clock. So that letter of disapproval will have a date on it. 60 days from that date, that letter of disapproval expires. So if you wait to retest more than 60 days, you're going to have to take the entire test, including the oral, all over again. So your goal should be, if you receive a disapproval, get additional training and come back and retest within 60 days. If you do that, first of all, it's going to be you're going to have to make a new application. That application will look identical. So let's say you received a disapproval for your commercial. You're going to make another commercial pilot Checkride application in 8710. And in the questionnaire, it'll ask you, have you received a disapproval for this test before? You'll answer yes, and then you'll select one disapproval. So you need to get the application done. Then you're going to need an additional endorsement saying that you've received training, additional training after a failed practical test. Your instructor will sign off on that training, and then you'll come back and retest. Now, all the same rules apply for that retest, so you need to have all the same qualifications. And as long as you were qualified going into that test, then nothing should have changed. But I'm just saying the endorsements and everything need to still be current. I think if you wait until after they're not current, you're going to be well past the 60 days anyway. So I've had one instance where a written test expired in between the disapproval and the retest. That doesn't extend. So when I say that everything needs to be current, that there's other things in there that need to be valid, like your written exam results. They can't have expired between the time that you took your Checkride and your retest. Also, driver's license, your medical, all that stuff still needs to be valid, because we're going to have to go through another Checkride kind of admin process at the beginning of this. Now, when it comes time for the retest activity itself, the admin portion is going to be a lot quicker, especially if you do it with the same examiner, because I've already looked at your logbooks and everything. I've verified you're qualified, so I'll re-qualify you, basically looking at your driver's license, medical, and test results again, make sure they're all good to go. And then as long as the failure wasn't for the oral, we probably won't. I might ask some questions related to the item that you received a disapproval for, and we'll do a pre-flight briefing. But we're not going to do an entire oral again. Nothing says that I have to do that. Now, I could, but I'm not going to do that 9 times out of 10. I can't really think of a reason why I would redo the whole oral. So it's going to be a lot quicker. We're going to get out to the plane a lot quicker. Now, just because we're on this faster pace, don't let that get you complacent. Make sure that you're doing a good pre-flight. You're doing a passenger briefing again. Treat it like another Checkride. We're going to get in the plane, and let's say it was for steep turns. I don't have to grade you necessarily on the taxi out and the takeoff and the departure, the climb out, the level off, the straight and level flying to the area, right? We're just grading those steep turns and then coming back and you're doing a landing. So let's say you did everything correctly except steep turns. And you fly out to the area, you do the steep turns great, and you're like, oh man, I'm so glad I got this over with. And you come back and you just make some silly mistakes and wind up having a really bad landing. I could issue a disapproval for that landing, and I probably will, because that was still during a Checkride. And even though that wasn't one of the items that you had to retest for, you still did it during the Checkride event. So, even though you're not being graded on all the other areas that you have to do in order to get to the steep turns, still treat it like you're taking a Checkride. Treat it seriously. So that's one thing I would bring up. Now, if you wind up failing a second time, that's really gonna stink, but it's still not a big deal. It's still not the end of the world. It's embarrassing. I'm not gonna pretend that it'll be the best day of your life. It will not be a fun day. I really don't enjoy that as an examiner. Most of the time I issue a certificate and it's successful, probably 85% pass rate or so. So 85% of the time, I get to have somebody's best day with them, right? I get to give them a certificate, and they're going to remember that day a long time, like, the day that I passed my private or commercial or CFI initial. There's a lot of satisfaction that comes with that, a lot of good feelings, good vibes. It's a lot of fun. I don't like issuing a disapproval because I know that that's kind of creating an indelible kind of negative memory that now I'm a part of. So I see it as my goal as an examiner once I issue a disapproval, is I want to kind of mentor that person that I've had to disapprove as much as I can to turn it into a positive experience. I don't need to add to the negativity at all, and I just know that I really don't enjoy it. It's just something that has to happen if you're outside of the tolerances in the ACS. So 60-day timeline after you get your disapproval. That's what we're looking at there. And if you go past the 60-day, you just have to retake the entire test again. If you want to read this for yourself, it's in the Airman Certifications, the Airman Certification Standards, like I said, on page 8-9. Now I'm going to cover another document here that I haven't covered so far in the series, but I plan on probably doing some more videos and shows on in the future, and that's the document called the 8900.1. The 8900.1 is, it used to be called the Flight Standards Information Management System, or FISMS. It's actually a document, but it works more like a system now. So used to it was a document, now it's more of a website type thing. And you can find that on the Dynamic Regulatory System, or FAA DRS. And then on the left-hand column of the DRS page, you can see the order 8900.1 contents. You click on that, and Volume 5, which is Airman Certification, discusses that basically this is kind of the DPE Bible. We use the ACS and the 8900.1. So this is a good resource to go to just to find out more of the admin, kind of behind-the-scenes stuff of what goes on with the Checkride. But in Chapter 2, there Volume 5, Chapter 1, there we go. Volume 5, Chapter 1, Section 6 is issuance of notice of disapproval of application. So this is kind of the FAA's guidance on issuing a notice of disapproval of application. So this is the admin stuff that the examiner is going to have to be familiar with when issuing a disapproval. So I'm not going to read through that. That's several pages long, but you can look that up yourself. It's so the 8900.1, Volume 5, Chapter 1, Section 6 is the section that goes over the notice of disapproval. Chapter 2 is Part 61, Certification of Pilots and Flight Instructors. So here's where we have, Section 7, Conduct a Private Pilot Certification, including additional category and class ratings. So that's kind of the behind-the-scenes document, the 8900.1, of how we are supposed to conduct those. So that gives you information on top of the ACS. I know I've beaten up the ACS so far for private, instrument, commercial, but we'll probably get into the 8900.1 on a couple of episodes and at least talk about kind of behind the scenes, what are we as examiners using in addition to the ACS to conduct the check rides. All right, so we've covered kind of what you could do to fail a check ride, potentially what's going to happen afterwards, kind of that 60-day timeline, the re-examination. I guess one thing that I'll leave you with is usually when I issue disapproval, I want to talk to your instructor. And I'm going to talk to your instructor both so that they're clear on what the disapproval is for, but also know about what training you need to do in order to, or what training I think you need to do. And I'm not allowed to basically say this is specifically what you have to do, but I'm going to give you that suggestion. So if you fail at steep turns, I may give your recommending instructor some ideas of what you could go out and work on. So I'm going to try to do my best to give you basically a training plan saying, hey, go out and fly. Do, these 3 things and then come back and retest. On the retest itself, 60 days is the max, but it could be as little as just a couple of hours. So I've had this happen more than once, is landing short on a short field or a power off 180. That's, like I said, that's an automatic failure. So I tell that to the applicant during the briefing. If it happens during the flight and it's early enough in the day and there's an instructor available, if you go out with an instructor right after the failure, we finish up the paperwork, you go out, you get a flight in where you land on the paint a couple times, you don't land short, you can come back and retest on the same day. I've done that several times. In fact, I think, well, maybe a little more than half of my disapprovals have been cleaned up on that same day, because usually it's just kind of one of those unfortunate things that I can't let go, either because the ACS says so, or it's just, so blatantly clear. And it's not a systemic problem with you as a pilot, right? It's not something that you need to work on for hours and hours and hours. It's really just something that you need to go, okay, well, I can't land short, so let me go up with this instructor, not land short a couple of times. The instructor's like, yeah, I think you got this. You go back, and they do. It's every time that's occurred, we've cleaned it up on that same day. So it may not be, waiting all that 60 days. You're just waiting, maybe just a couple hours. And it's still, it's not fun, but it happens. So I hope that you found this useful in learning more about a disapproval. Hopefully it helps you be maybe a little more calm going into Checkride, understanding that, hey, if I do get a disapproval, it's not a big deal, and I know what's going to happen if I do get a disapproval now. So kind of taking some of that mystery away. So if you're watching this video and you have a friend about to take a Checkride, let them or tell them to watch this. Say, even though you don't plan on failing, it helps to know what happens if you fail, right? Because I think it'll get rid of some of the nerves. Thanks again for watching and listening, and I will talk to you next time. See ya.